The water wars of Willow Creek. It started with the tomatoes. Jacob Hensley had always prided himself on his tomatoes, plump, red, and bursting with flavor, the kind that won blue ribbons at the Willow Creek County Fair 3 years running. His farm, a sprawling patchwork of fields and orchards just outside town, had been in his family for 4 generations, and he'd spent decades perfecting every inch of it. So when those prized plants began to droop one scorching July morning, Jacob knew something was wrong. The air was thick with the dry heat of summer, the kind that made the horizon shimmer and turned the dirt underfoot into a fine, choking dust. It hadn't rained in weeks, but that shouldn't have mattered. His farm's irrigation system, a network of pipes and valves fed by a deep, reliable well, had kept his crops thriving through worse droughts than this. Every morning, he'd walk the rows, checking the soil, listening to the steady drip, drip, drip of water feeding his plants. But that morning, the leaves hung limp, yellowing at the edges, as if they'd been abandoned to the sun's mercy. Thirsty as a mule lost in the Badlands, he muttered to himself, crouching down to inspect a wilted stem. He pressed his fingers into the soil, bone dry. Not a trace of moisture. At first, he figured it was a simple fix. A leak, maybe. A busted pipe underground, letting the water seep away before it could reach his crops. He spent the next hour trudging along the irrigation lines, shovel in hand, sweat beading on his brow as he checked every valve, every joint. Everything was in working order. No cracks, no puddles, no signs of trouble. The system hummed along as it always had, the pump pulling water from the well with its familiar low rumble. But then he saw it, the water meter. Tucked beside the pump house, its little dials spun faster than he'd ever seen them. Usage was through the roof, double, maybe triple what it should have been for his usual routine. Jacob scratched his head, his calloused fingers tugging at the brim of his worn baseball cap. He hadn't changed a thing. No new fields, no extra watering. So where was all that water going? He straightened up, wiping the sweat from his face with the back of his hand, and let his gaze drift across his property. Beyond the sagging tomato vines and the parched corn stalks, his land stretched out in a patchwork of brown and fading green. And then there was her yard, Lillian Carver's lawn. Right across the property line, separated by a rickety wooden fence Jacob had built himself 20 years ago, was a site that didn't belong in the middle of a drought. A lawn so lush and vibrant it could have been ripped from the pages of a gardening magazine. Emerald grass, perfectly trimmed, framed by neat flower beds bursting with color, roses, petunias, even a row of hydrangeas that looked like they'd been pampered by a team of landscapers. It was the kind of yard that screamed money and attention, not the sort you'd expect next to a working farm in the dog days of summer. Lillian Carver was Jacob's neighbor, or, more accurately, his nemesis. She'd moved into the little house next door 5 years back, a city transplant with a pinched smile and a knack for finding fault in everything Jacob did. She'd complained about his rooster crowing at dawn, called the county when his tractor kicked up too much dust, and once even tried to sue him over a stray goat that wandered into her rose bushes. She wasn't just unfriendly. She was downright hostile, treating Jacob's farm like a personal affront to her vision of suburban perfection. And now, there she was, her lawn glowing like a beacon while his crops withered. Jacob narrowed his eyes, a suspicion creeping into his mind. It didn't make sense. Lillian didn't have a well. He'd have known if she did. Permits like that were public record in Willow Creek. The town's water supply was metered and expensive, and no one in their right mind would spend that kind of cash just to keep a lawn green during a drought. So how was she doing it? He spent the rest of the day watching her place from a distance, leaning against his porch railing with a glass of iced tea in hand. Lillian flitted in and out of her house, pruning her flowers, adjusting her sprinklers, acting like she didn't have a care in the world. Every now and then, she'd glance his way, her lips pursed in that smug little smirk he'd come to loathe. By evening, his tea was warm and his patience was gone. Something was off, and he was going to find out what. That night, after the sun dipped below the horizon and the crickets took over the soundtrack, Jacob grabbed a flashlight and slipped out to his fields. The air was cooler now, but still heavy with the scent of dry earth. He moved quietly, keeping low as he followed the irrigation line toward the fence. If there was a leak, or worse, he'd spot it. He didn't have to look far. Near the edge of his property, where the fence met a tangle of wild blackberry bushes, he found the valve that controlled the main flow from his well. And there, glinting faintly in the beam of his flashlight, was something that made his stomach drop, a hose. Not one of his, a cheap, green garden hose, coiled like a snake and hooked up to his system with a rusty clamp. It stretched under the fence, disappearing into Lillian's yard. Jacob's jaw tightened. He followed the hose, stepping over the fence onto her property, just a few feet, just enough to see where it led. Sure enough, it snaked across her lawn, ending at a sprinkler head buried in the grass. The evidence was undeniable. Lillian Carver wasn't just watering her lawn with town water or some secret well. She was stealing his water, siphoning it right out of his irrigation system to keep her precious yard pristine while his farm suffered. For a moment, he stood there, the flashlight trembling in his hand as anger boiled up inside him. This wasn't some petty neighborly spat anymore. This was theft, brazen, calculated theft. His crops, his livelihood, were dying because Lillian couldn't stand a brown patch on her lawn. The audacity of it, the sheer gall, made his blood pound in his ears. He could have ripped the hose out right then, marched over to her house, and woken her up with a piece of his mind. But Jacob Hensley wasn't a man who acted on impulse. He'd been farming long enough to know that revenge, like a good harvest, took patience. He turned off the flashlight, letting the darkness swallow him as he headed back to his house. Lillian wanted his water? Fine. She could have it, just not the way she expected. The next morning, Jacob was up before the sun, his boots crunching on the gravel drive as he made his way to Lillian's house. His temper had simmered overnight, hardening into something colder, more deliberate. He wasn't just mad anymore. He was ready. In his pocket, his phone held the evidence, shaky footage he'd recorded in the dark, the flashlight beam catching Lillian's hose hooked up to his valve like a leech on a vein. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The sky was streaked with pink and gold as he reached her front door, a tidy little porch adorned with a wicker chair and a wreath of dried lavender. Everything about Lillian's house screamed perfection, from the spotless windows to the manicured shrubs lining the walkway. It was all fake, Jacob thought, built on stolen water and a whole lot of nerve. He knocked hard, 3 sharp raps that rattled the wreath. For a minute, there was nothing but silence. Then came the faint shuffle of footsteps, and the door swung open. Lillian stood there in a crisp white blouse and tailored slacks, her blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like she was about to host a garden club meeting, not face down a furious farmer at dawn. Her eyes flicked over him, taking in his dusty jeans and flannel shirt, and that smug little smile curled her lips. "Good morning, Jacob," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "What brings you over so early?" He took a deep breath, forcing his tone to stay even. "Lillian, we need to talk about my water." Her smile didn't budge, but something flickered in her eyes. Panic, maybe, or irritation. She tilted her head, playing dumb. "Your water?" "I don't follow." "Yes, my water," Jacob said, his voice tightening despite his efforts. "The water you've been siphoning from my irrigation system." For a split second, her mask slipped. Her lips parted, her brows twitching upward before she caught herself. Then she laughed, a high, artificial sound that grated on his nerves. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. Why would I do something like that?" Jacob didn't blink. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up for her to see. The video played, grainy but clear. The hose, the valve, the unmistakable path leading straight to her sprinklers. Her face froze as she watched, her smile fading into a tight line. When the clip ended, she let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes like he was some annoying kid tattling to the teacher. "Okay, fine," she said, crossing her arms. "I may have borrowed a little water. But it's just water, Jacob. You've got so much of it, and I only needed a bit to keep my lawn looking nice. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal." He stared at her, incredulous. "You've been stealing from me, Lillian." "Stealing? My crops are dying because of you. And you didn't even have the decency to ask." "Oh, come on," she snapped, dropping the sweet act. "Don't be so dramatic. What's a little water between neighbors?" He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to shout. She wasn't sorry, not even close. She stood there, chin high, acting like he was the unreasonable one. like she hadn't crossed a line that no one in Willow Creek would dare step over. Stealing from a farmer wasn't just a prank. It was a betrayal, a gut punch to the people who kept this town alive. "I could have called the sheriff last night," he said, his voice low and steady. "I could have yanked that hose out and let you explain yourself to the law. But I didn't. Not yet." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for a bluff. "So why didn't you?" "Because I wanted to give you a chance to make this right," he lied. He'd already made up his mind about what came next, but she didn't need to know that. "Admit what you did. Stop it, and we'll call it even." Lillian scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "Admit what? That I took a tiny bit of water you weren't even using? Please, enjoy your little tantrum, Jacob. This is over." She turned to shut the door, but he stepped forward, his voice cutting through the morning air. "If that's how you feel about it, Lillian." She paused, glancing back at him. "That's how I feel about it." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "All right then." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his farm, her gaze burning into his back. She thought she'd won, thought he'd slink off and let her keep her perfect lawn and her perfect lie. But Jacob wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Jacob spent the rest of that day in his barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and motor oil. His mind churned, turning over every detail of Lillian's smug dismissal. "What's a little water between neighbors?" she'd said, as if his farm, his life's work, was some communal resource she could dip into whenever she pleased. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the fields in shades of orange and gold, he'd made up his mind. If Lillian wanted his water so badly, he'd give it to her, on his terms. He rummaged through the barn, past stacks of seed bags and rusted tools, until he found what he was looking for, a barrel of organic liquid fertilizer. It was the good stuff, packed with nutrients for his crops, but it had a downside, a stench so potent it could knock a buzzard off a manure pile. Harmless, legal, and perfect for what he had in mind. He hauled the barrel to his workbench, grinning for the first time all day. Under the cover of darkness, Jacob set his plan in motion. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across his fields as he dragged the hose back to his side of the fence. He disconnected it from Lillian's sprinklers, careful not to make a sound, and swapped out the clean water line with a hose he'd rigged to the fertilizer barrel. It took some fiddling, clamping the lines, testing the flow, but by midnight, everything was ready. The next time Lillian turned on her sprinklers, she'd get a surprise she wouldn't soon forget. He barely slept that night, anticipation buzzing through him like a swarm of restless bees. At dawn, he was up, perched on his porch with a steaming mug of coffee, waiting for the show. The first rays of sunlight crept over the horizon, glinting off the dew on his wilting tomato plants. Across the fence, Lillian's house was quiet, her blinds still drawn. Then it happened. A faint click echoed from her yard as her sprinkler system kicked on, right on schedule. For a moment, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the soft hiss of water misting the air. Then came the smell. It rolled across the property line like a fog, a rancid, earthy reek that made Jacob's eyes water even from his porch. The sprinklers sprayed a fine mist of fertilizer across Lillian's lawn, soaking the grass, the flower beds, the white picket fence she'd painted last spring. Lillian emerged a minute later, still in her fluffy pink robe, her hair in curlers. She stepped onto her porch, sniffed the air, and froze. Her nose wrinkled, her head tilting in confusion. Then realization hit. She let out a screech that could have shattered glass, a high-pitched wail that sent a flock of sparrows scattering from Jacob's barn roof. "What is that?" she shrieked, racing down her steps in a panic. She waved her arms at the sprinklers, as if she could stop them with sheer willpower, but the damage was done. The stench clung to everything. Her lawn, her garden gnomes, even the fancy patio furniture she'd bragged about buying from some upscale catalog. Jacob sipped his coffee, fighting to keep a straight face as Lillian darted around her yard like a headless chicken. She grabbed the hose, yanking at it frantically, but it was still clamped tight to his valve. By the time she gave up and ran inside, presumably to call someone, anyone, to fix the mess, the fertilizer had soaked deep into her precious grass. And then came the best part, the garden party. Lillian had been planning it for weeks, dropping hints to anyone who'd listen about her exclusive summer soiree. Jacob had overheard her on the phone one afternoon, boasting about the catered hors d'oeuvres and the string quartet she'd hired from the city. Now, as the first guests pulled up in their shiny sedans, he leaned back in his chair, watching the chaos unfold. The smell hit them before they even stepped out of their cars. A woman in a sundress gagged, clapping a hand over her mouth. A man in a blazer wrinkled his nose, muttering something to his wife before they both climbed back into their SUV and peeled out. One by one, Lillian's guests arrived, only to flee moments later, their faces twisted in disgust. Lillian stood in her driveway, her robe flapping as she waved her arms, shouting apologies and explanations. "It's just a temporary issue," she called, her voice cracking. "Please come back." But no one did. The last car, a sleek black Mercedes, sped off, leaving her alone in her stinking paradise. She turned then, her gaze locking onto Jacob across the fence. Even from a distance, he could see the fury in her eyes, the way her shoulders heaved with every breath. She knew. He raised his coffee mug in a silent toast, a slow smile spreading across his face. She'd stolen his water, and he'd returned the favor, with a little extra seasoning. By noon, the neighborhood was buzzing. Folks in Willow Creek didn't miss much, and word of Lillian's ruined party spread like wildfire. Old man Pritchard, who ran the feed store, stopped by to drop off a sack of grain and couldn't resist a jab. "Heard Carver's lawn smells worse than my compost heap," he chuckled, tipping his hat. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Jake?" Jacob just shrugged, playing innocent. "Can't say I do, Tom. Sounds like a real shame, though." The day wore on, and Lillian stayed out of sight, probably scrubbing her yard with every cleaner she could find. Jacob figured that was the end of it. She'd gotten her comeuppance, and he'd made his point. His crops still needed water, but he'd already started rerouting the system to cut off her access for good. Lesson learned, he thought. He was wrong. The next morning, Jacob woke to the sound of Lillian's voice, sharp and shrill, drifting over from her yard. He stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand, and saw her pacing back and forth in that same pink robe, a phone pressed to her ear. She gestured wildly at her sprinklers, her free hand stabbing the air as if she could intimidate the stench into leaving. "No, I don't know what it is," she snapped into the phone. "It's ruining everything. I need someone out here today." He couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but he didn't need to. The fertilizer had done its job. Her lawn was a patchy mess, the once vibrant green fading to sickly yellow where the excess nutrients had burned the grass. The smell lingered, a constant reminder of her mistake. Jacob leaned against the railing, savoring the sight. Justice had a funny way of smelling awful. But Lillian wasn't one to give up easily. By noon, she'd stormed across the property line, her designer sandals kicking up dust as she marched toward his porch. Her face was twisted in outrage, her eyes blazing with a fury that could have lit a bonfire. "You think you're funny, don't you?" she barked, stopping at the foot of his steps. Jacob set his coffee down, crossing his arms with a calm he didn't entirely feel. "Morning, Lillian. Something on your mind?" She jabbed a manicured finger at him, her voice trembling with rage. "Don't play dumb with me, Jacob Hensley. My lawn. That disgusting smell. You did something to my water." He tilted his head, feigning confusion. "Oh, you mean the water you stole from my farm?" Her mouth opened, then snapped shut, her cheeks flushing a deep red. She couldn't deny it, not after he'd caught her on video, but she wasn't about to back down, either. "This is harassment," she spat. "You can't just poison someone's lawn because you're bitter." "Poison?" Jacob let out a slow, exaggerated sigh. "It's not poison, Lillian. It's organic fertilizer, 100% safe, legal, and great for crops. Just not so great for stolen water systems." He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to make her squirm. "Funny how that works, huh?" Her hands balled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "I should call the HOA. Or the county. You farmers think you can do whatever you want. But this is sabotage." He raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "So let me get this straight. You stole my water, got caught, and now you're mad because you didn't like what came out of the pipe you hooked up to? That about right?" Lillian hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. She knew she was on shaky ground. If she pushed too hard, she'd have to admit her own crime. But admitting fault wasn't in her nature. Instead, she huffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder like she was dismissing a servant. "Enjoy your little victory," she sneered. "This isn't over." With that, she spun on her heel and marched back to her house, leaving a trail of indignation in her wake. Jacob watched her go, a knot of unease forming in his gut. He'd underestimated her pettiness before. Lillian wasn't just angry, she was vengeful. And people like her didn't slink away quietly. Over the next few days, Jacob kept busy repairing his irrigation system. He capped the valve she'd tapped into, rerouting the lines to make sure she couldn't pull the same stunt again. His crops were still struggling, but with the water back where it belonged, they'd recover. He figured Lillian would sulk, maybe try to scrub the smell out with chemicals, and eventually let it go. Then, 3 nights later, he heard it, a faint rustling near his well. At first, he thought it was a raccoon or a stray dog, common enough out here. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside, the cool night air prickling his skin. The beams swept across the fields, catching the glint of dew on the corn stalks. Nothing unusual, but as he neared the well, he spotted shadows moving, human shadows. He crept closer, his boots silent on the soft earth, and saw them. 2 men, hunched over with shovels, digging near his waterline. A few feet away, Lillian stood watching, her arms crossed, her silhouette unmistakable even in the dark. She'd hired help, actual workers this time, not just a sneaky hose, and they were tearing into his property like they owned it. Jacob's blood ran hot. She wasn't just stealing water anymore. She was escalating to full-on trespassing and vandalism. He stepped into the light, clearing his throat loud enough to make them jump. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, keeping his tone light despite the anger simmering beneath it. "Digging for buried treasure, are we?" The 2 men froze, one still gripping a shovel half buried in the dirt. Lillian let out a nervous laugh, stepping forward. "Oh, we were just, checking something. Property lines and all that." He gave her a slow, unimpressed nod. "Right. Property lines. And that explains why you're knee-deep in my water supply." The workers exchanged uneasy glances. One muttered, "Didn't sign up for this," and tossed his shovel aside, brushing past Lillian as he headed for the road. The other followed, leaving her alone in the dirt. "You don't even use all this water," she argued, her voice rising. "I just need a little." Jacob shook his head, incredulous. "Stealing isn't borrowing, Lillian. And digging on my land? That's a new level of stupid." Her eyes darted around, searching for an out, but she had none. "Fine," she huffed. "I'll stop. But you're being ridiculous." He pulled out his phone, snapping pictures of the half-dug trench. "You'll stop because I'm calling the sheriff." That got her attention. Her posture stiffened, her hands clenching. "You wouldn't. Try me." She glared at him a moment longer, then let out a frustrated growl and stomped off, her retreat echoing through the night. Jacob didn't call the sheriff, not yet, but he had the photos now. If she tried anything else, he'd be ready. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. Jacob kept a close eye on his property, half expecting Lillian to sneak back under cover of darkness with a new scheme. Her lawn remained a stinking, patchy disaster, and she didn't even try to fix it. That should have been his first clue she was planning something bigger. The trouble came one evening when he noticed a strange truck parked near her house. It wasn't a contractor's rig or one of the usual maintenance vans that rolled through Willow Creek. This was something heavier, industrial, with a logo he couldn't quite make out in the fading light. His gut twisted. Something was up. He grabbed his binoculars, kept handy for spotting hawks in the fields, and watched from his porch. Lillian emerged from her house, dressed in a crisp blazer and skirt, looking more like a real estate agent than a petty thief. She met a group of workers near the truck, pointing toward his land with a clipboard in hand. One man nodded, scribbling notes, while another unloaded equipment, digging machinery, pipes, the works. Jacob's stomach sank. She wasn't just siphoning water anymore. She was going all in, trying to tap his well directly, legally or not. He strode across his fields, his boots kicking up dust as he approached. The workers noticed him first, shifting uncomfortably as he neared. Lillian kept her back to him, pretending not to see until he was close enough to cast a shadow over her clipboard. "Evening, Lillian," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Mind telling me why you've got a crew out here on my property line?" She turned, flashing that sickly sweet smile he'd come to dread. "Oh, I'm just doing some upgrades to my property, making a few improvements." He glanced at the machinery. The pipes pointed straight toward his well. "Upgrades, huh? And those upgrades just happen to involve digging into my water supply." Her smile faltered, but she waved a hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic. It's just a minor project. Nothing that concerns you." One of the workers piped up, hesitant. Ma'am, you didn't mention anything about a well on the other side of the line." Lillian shot him a glare that could have curdled milk. "It's fine," she snapped, but the damage was done. The worker's words hung in the air, proof she'd lied to them. "You're trespassing," Jacob said, folding his arms. "And you're trying to steal my water illegally." "Again," she scoffed, her face reddening. "It's not illegal. You're being ridiculous. Water's a shared resource. If you weren't so greedy, you'd help your neighbors." "I help my neighbors, Lillian," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not a neighbor. You're a thief." Her lips parted, then closed, her argument crumbling. Before she could recover, Jacob pulled out his phone. "You've got two choices. Pack up and leave, or I call the sheriff and let him sort this out." The workers didn't wait for her response. They started backing away, abandoning their gear as they muttered excuses and headed for the truck. Lillian watched them go, her expression shifting from anger to desperation. "This is harassment," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You think you can bully me off my own property?" He gestured to the equipment, still on his land. "This isn't your property, Lillian." She opened her mouth, then shut it, realizing she had no ground to stand on. Without another word, she spun around and stormed back to her house, slamming the door so hard the windows shook. Jacob watched the truck peel out, dust billowing in its wake. He'd stopped her again, but he knew better than to think it was over. Lillian was stubborn as a mule and twice as spiteful. She'd be back. Jacob thought catching Lillian with a digging crew would be the end of it. He'd warned her, humiliated her, even threatened legal action. Any sane person would have taken the hint and backed off. But Lillian wasn't sane, she was obsessed. For a week, she stayed quiet. No more hoses, no more workers, no more confrontations. Her lawn sat in ruins, the fertilizer's stench fading, but the grass still patchy and dead. Jacob kept watch, patrolling his property line each evening with a flashlight, but nothing happened. He started to relax, figuring she'd finally run out of steam. Then the for sale sign went up. It appeared one morning, staked into her front yard like a white flag of surrender. "For sale by owner," it read in bold red letters, with Lillian's phone number scrawled beneath. Jacob stood on his porch, coffee in hand, staring at it in disbelief. After all the fighting, all the scheming, she was leaving? It didn't add up. He called Tom Pritchard at the feed store, the closest thing Willow Creek had to a gossip hub. "You hear anything about Carver selling her place?" Tom chuckled through the phone. "Heard she's had enough. Word is, that stink you. Someone put in her yard drove off her fancy friends. Plus, the HOA's been sniffing around about her water bill. She's done, Jake." Jacob hung up, a grin tugging at his lips. Maybe the fertilizer had broken her after all. Maybe she'd realized she couldn't win this war. But he wasn't about to let her slink away without a parting shot. Early the next morning, before the moving trucks arrived, he left a gift on her porch, a small bag with a container of the same organic fertilizer that had ruined her lawn. Taped to it was a note, "For your next lawn. Hope it thrives." He was back on his porch, sipping coffee, when she found it. The shriek she let out was loud enough to wake half the county, her silhouette flailing as she yanked the for sale sign out of the ground in a fit of rage. She glared across the fence, but he just raised his mug in another silent toast. A few days later, she was gone. The moving trucks rolled out, leaving her house empty and silent. Jacob watched from his fields, a mix of relief and satisfaction settling over him. His crops were recovering, his water was secure, and Lillian Carver was someone else's problem now. The house sat vacant for a month, its windows dark and its lawn a testament to Lillian's downfall. Jacob got used to the quiet, the absence of her constant complaints a welcome change. His farm thrived again, the tomatoes ripening under the late summer sun, the corn stalks standing tall. Life felt normal, better than normal, even. Then the new neighbors arrived. It was a Saturday morning when the moving van pulled up, followed by a dusty pickup truck with a bike rack on the back. A family spilled out, two kids chasing each other around the yard, a woman unloading boxes, and a man waving at Jacob from across the fence. "Morning," the man called, jogging over with a grin. "Name's Mike Reynolds. Just moved in with the wife and kids." Jacob set down his rake, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Jacob Hensley. Welcome to Willow Creek." Mike was a wiry guy with a friendly laugh, the kind of neighbor Jacob hadn't had in years. His wife, Sarah, brought over a plate of cookies that afternoon, and the kids, Emma and Lucas, spent hours exploring the edge of his fields, asking questions about the tractor and the chickens. They were a breath of fresh air, respectful and curious, a stark contrast to Lillian's reign of terror. Best of all, they watered their lawn with their own water. Mike showed Jacob the hookup to the town supply one day, laughing about how they'd never dream of tapping a farmer's well. "Heard about the last lady who lived here," he said, shaking his head. "Sounds like she was a real piece of work." "You have no idea," Jacob replied, chuckling. The Reynolds family settled in, and the neighborhood felt whole again. Every now and then, Jacob would pass Lillian's old house and smile, remembering the war he'd fought and won. She'd thought she could steal from a farmer, but in the end, all she'd gotten was a lesson she'd carry to her next lawn, wherever that might be. And Jacob? He got his water back, his peace back, and a story that'd be told in Willow Creek for years to come.